Welcome to Democracy Differently, the podcast about why democracy isn't working and how to fix it. So we have a bit of a different episode for you today for the final one of the series, and I'm joined with my co-host Keith in the hot seat. Keith is a professor of political theory and ethics at University of Warwick, and his current work focuses on democratic innovation and justice. And today we're going to talk specifically about Keith's work on democratic inclusion and the role of empathy in democracy. So, as always, we can begin with the first question. So, in a sentence, Keith, what do you see as the biggest single problem for democracy?
I think the incentives built into our democratic systems are all wrong, and they're forcing politicians, even when they have the right motivations, to do the wrong things.
Great, cool. So, before we kind of jump into your work, I think it might be quite nice for us to have a talk about why you are so interested in democratic innovation in the first place, and just democracy more generally.
Well, I think we can see a lot of things going wrong in the world, everything from climate change to the rise of populism to AI not being governed the way we would want it to be. And underneath all of those problems, ultimately, there's questions about democracy and how democracy works and why it's not managing to deal with those problems correctly. So I'm interested in democratic innovation as a way to ultimately solve those problems and get governance working more effectively.
Nice. So what kind of inspired you to think about empathy then, and how that can be useful?
So there's all these different democratic innovations out there, loads of really good ideas, and that's partly what this podcast is about communicating some of those ideas. And it got me thinking, well, ultimately what a lot of these innovations are trying to do is motivate everyone from politicians to voters to do things that are more in humanities and in society's better interests. And one of the key motivational tools is empathy. Right? When we feel empathy for someone, it motivates us to do stuff to help people, and it also gives us an insight into their experience, their understanding. And there's been a huge upsurge in interest in empathy precisely for this reason. It's seen as something that can motivate people and increase people's understanding of how to improve the lives of others. And if you can scale that up to the level of democracy, that could potentially help democracy go a lot better. But at the same time, there's this other view that says, well, the problem with empathy is it can lead to bias because you only feel empathy for some people. So there's been this standoff, right, between the pro-empathy people and those that have got worries about empathy leading to bias. And so for me, the interesting question was, can we navigate our way through these two extremes to say, well, look, empathy is really useful for democracy if we use it in the right way, and if so, what are those ways of using empathy?
Yeah, so if we want to use empathy then to kind of inspire people to think about other people's interests, why is that so important for democracy, and kind of what kind of problems, I guess, arise if we don't think about people's interests?
Well, it comes back to the way that democracies are structured. So voters live within a particular country, and they're also part of a particular generation, and then within that we have some votes, whichever party's in power, tends to represent the votes of the majority. So some people get left out, the minorities, people living in other countries that maybe have kind of needs based on humanitarianism or development needs, and of course future generations. And so you have policy making skewed towards particular groups, those that are most way on the minds of politicians. So the idea of introducing empathy into democracy is to say, well, look, we don't only think about our own interests, we also think about the interests of people we care about. And if we can use empathy to bridge those gaps and to get people at every level thinking about the interests of other people and caring about that, then we can start to bridge these gaps and bring in more interest into how we make political decisions.
Great, thank you. And I guess since we're both philosophers, we both love definitions. So empathy is one of these kind of terms that seems to be battered about quite a lot. So could you explain more about the type of empathy that you're really focused on?
Yes, absolutely. So empathy is often divided into two types. So you've got cognitive empathy, which is about thinking and understanding how other people feel. That's so where you imagine how they feel, but you're not necessarily sort of emotionally involved in it. It's a cognitive process. So this is really useful for democracy insofar as by understanding how other people are experiencing the world and thinking, first of all, you can help to increase mutual understanding. You can see things from other people's perspective. And secondly, you can understand what needs to happen to kind of improve their lives. You're a policymaker. If you have no insight into the experience of other people, then you're going to start making the wrong policies. And second, you have what's sometimes called affective empathy, which is about emotion. And that's when you see someone, say, suffering, when you see your child crying, or you experience something where someone's in distress, then you feel an emotional reaction yourself. It's not always the same reaction as the other person, but it's some kind of sense of emotion. And that's called affective empathy. And again, that's really useful for democracy because it has a strong motivating power, right? So if people feel that emotion, this is why newspapers, charities, they try and conjure up images of what it's like for people, because it tries to motivate people to be involved and to care about that. So I think both types of empathy are really useful and important for democracy. One, because of the understanding, and two, because of the motivation.
Thanks, and that leads nicely on to my next question, which was about how is empathy discussed and I guess already used in democracies, and how can that help us with democratic innovation?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there are some authors, people like Martha Nussbaum, who advocate that we should just generally try to increase empathy across the board. So things like using film, literature, to kind of increase people's empathetic engagement with other people across different communities and countries, and that will lead to just generally better democracy. And then we've got the more targeted approaches, which are based on what we've talked about in some of the other episodes, this idea of deliberative democracy, so people coming together in forums like citizens' assemblies to talk about things. And they've stressed that empathy can be really, really useful in those kind of contexts. So partly that's just because empathy arises naturally when you're talking to other people about these problems. But secondly, where you can kind of build your procedures within these forums, within like a citizens' assembly around developing empathy, you get much better conversations. People can understand each other. They can be motivated to reach solutions together. So if we were moving more towards that kind of a model of democracy, then empathy would be useful in that context also.
Great, thanks. And you spoke earlier about how there's maybe this kind of anti-empathy sort of side to the debate. And I think it is true, right, that empathy can kind of lead to us to only really empathise with people that have similar experiences to us, and it kind of reinforces our own biases. If we focus more on empathy then in our democracy, how big is that risk for us, basically? Yeah,
no, that's the core question at the centre of this debate, and there's been a lot of research in psychology about when people struggle to empathise with others, and as you say, there are some factors that do seem to inhibit empathy, although some psychologists have argued they're not quite as extensive as is sometimes claimed, and it's perfectly possible to feel empathy across divisions. But certainly there are limits to how much empathy we can feel, and there are clearly some things that inhibit our ability to feel empathy. So the worry then is, if we try and build empathy more into how our democracies operate, we're going to end up just focusing on the people we empathise with and ignoring the rest. And that could make things worse, because it could just mean that we focus even more strongly on the interests of people like us. I think the answer is we have to think about how empathy is used in democracy in quite specific ways, right? So one thing I've argued, we should think about the context where empathy is being introduced. So the worry comes about if you're sort of, say, an impartial person, and then you're kind of being asked to feel empathy for a particular group. You might feel empathy for some more than others. But I would say, well, in a lot of contexts, we already belong to a particular group, right? We all have a gender, we all belong to the current generation, we all belong to particular social and national groups and so on. And so we naturally already have stronger connections there. So in those circumstances, if we're trying to induce empathy for people who don't belong to that group, whether that's future generations or people in different countries or a different social group, it's only going to make things better, right? Because you're addressing that empathy imbalance that you started with. So it's too broad brush, I'd say, to say empathy will always make things worse. The real, what we should be moving towards is thinking about when empathy can make things better and when it is too risky, and that will vary by different contexts.
Thanks. And you mentioned there the idea of inducing empathy in people. So how do we do that, basically? Yeah,
so this just means trying to get people to feel empathy when they didn't previously, or more empathy. I mentioned before, Martha Nussbaum talks about using literature and film and artistic methods to induce empathy, and that's certainly the case. You go see a good film and you get really sucked into it, or read a book, and that can be really effective for conveying other people's experiences. One thing that I also worked on is the idea that the strongest way to induce empathy is to really actually experience someone else's day-to-day life, face to face, to kind of actually go and see what it's like to spend time together. And certainly there's a lot of evidence that direct contact is a really strong way to induce empathy, both affective and cognitive, right? So understanding and emotion. So I'm interested in how within democracy we can use that strong form of empathy induction to foster a better democracy by increasing contact between different groups, between different countries, and thinking about ways to induce empathy for future generations, not just through things like films and literature, although that's useful, but also through direct contact.
That's really interesting. And in one of your papers, you kind of use the term generalised empathetic emotion and insight. Maybe that's quite technical. So what is it and why is it important?
Yeah, so it sounds technical, but really it's just the idea that when you feel empathy for a particular person or group, that often generalises. So the motivation and the insight that comes from that experience of empathy isn't just tied to the particular person, right? So if you maybe know someone who's gone through a particular illness, it's not that you then are motivated to help just that person, but quite often people will be motivated to do something about that internal, raise money or campaign or something. And that's how one experience of empathy can really generalise and can motivate us and increase our understanding to help a much broader group of people. And that's why I think there's potential for democracy, if we can think about how to utilise those kind of sometimes small scale but particular experiences of empathy and generalise them, so they apply to much broader groups. Then we can make a lot of progress on breaking down barriers and increasing understanding and motivation.
So it seems then that it's not just about getting people to feel empathy towards each other. It also maybe is about patterns of power and how we can map onto the patterns of empathy with those. Can you say a little bit more about that and how we kind of move from this kind of specific empathy for each other to this more mapping exercise? Yeah,
so it's a big ask to say just take democracy as it is and kind of try and increase empathy across the board. How do you do that? I mean, you can get so far, but I'm not sure we need to do that, right? Because there's actually so much empathy out there. All of us, all the time, well, a lot of the time, are having these engagements with other people, whether that's friends, family, whatever. We are engaging with other people and we feel a lot of empathy, but most of the time we don't have any power to do anything more than at the very small scale. So take people in a community, right? People might really want to do something to improve the way things are happening in their community. They have a lot of contact and empathy with other people in the community. They just don't have the political power. So my thought is, part of matching up power to empathy is not just trying to create more empathy, but also thinking, how can we empower these experiences of empathy, these empathic connections that are already there? And that might mean things like devolving power more to local communities where you have these empathetic connections already, so that the empathy that already exists in the world can be more empowered to do stuff, and use that as a framework for then rethinking more broadly, how would we go about rethinking democratic institutions in the kind of way that some of the other speakers on this podcast have talked about. Great.
Is it kind of a holistic approach then to empathy and the way that we can use it in democracy?
Yeah, so I think I talk in my work about a holistic approach in the sense that empathy is not small, but it's a part of the puzzle, but it can never be the whole answer, because ultimately what we're talking about is how to motivate people who participate in democracies at all levels, but particularly those who have more decision-making power, so politicians, to make better decisions in the interests of people within their societies, but also globally and future generations. So as I said, I think empathy can go a long way in motivating people, but in some circumstances it's just not feasible to generate more empathy, or so for example there's particular difficulties with future generations because they don't exist yet, so you can't have that direct contact, or there's worries about it resulting in bias, as we talked about earlier. And in those kind of circumstances there are other ways that we can help to redirect motivation. So that might mean rethinking the incentives that people are under, politicians in particular, so that, for example, they're not so incentivized by short-term electoral cycles, but they can be incentivized by more long-term considerations. Or it might be more trying to accentuate other kind of motivations, like a moral motivation to do the right thing. And in those kind of circumstances, I think we need to use all the tools in the toolbox. Mm-hmm. Empathy is one of them, but whatever kind of tools we can when thinking about how to reshape democracy, we need to be drawing on them.
Great, thanks. So you know the format, so I can do this now. So if we move on to some kind of more quick-fire questions. So
I'll try and be quicker than some of our guests.
So are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of democracy?
Well, democracy is a work in progress, always has been. I think we're going through a blip right now with the rise of populism. If we can get through that, then I'm sure that democracy will carry on reinventing itself and hopefully moving towards a better version of itself.
That was nice and short and sweet. How has empathy shaped your own views on democracy?
I think it's got me thinking about motivation, and now when I'm thinking about how to redesign democracy, I put motivation at the heart of how to think about that.
Great. And I guess this is a bit of a meta question, but why should we be speaking about democratic innovation and the threats to democracy on a podcast?
Well, I just think there's so many great ideas already out there being researched, being tried in the real world, that it's really important that conversation about where democracy is heading happens more broadly, and a podcast is a good way to contribute to that conversation.
So if you could interview anyone, they can be dead or alive, on the podcast, who would it be?
I would love to interview one of the leaders in the Paris Commune, which was an experiment in a more horizontal form of democracy. In fact, I would love to talk to them about what they think worked well in that experiment, what they could have done differently, and what lessons they think the Paris Commune has for where democracy is at now, and what kind of an alternative deliberative system we might set up instead.
Thanks. So how did you end up working as a political theorist in the first place?
I travelled a lot when I was younger, and I saw a lot of injustice in the world, and I saw political theory as a really good way to start understanding, what did that injustice mean, what would justice look like, and nowadays what sort of a democracy would contribute to making the world a less unjust place.
So Keith, for the final question, which you're very well versed with by now, I'm sure, if you had to pick one thing for democracy to do differently, what would it be and why?
I would like democracies to rethink how they incentivise decision makers, so that people are free to make the right decisions for the long term, for society and for the world more generally, and to build in more our better dispositions, so things like empathy, built more strongly into how democracies are structured.
Great, thank you. So thanks so much for joining us today and for the whole of the first series. We really hope you've enjoyed getting to know Keith in this one today and his work much better. And if you enjoyed the episode and the series, don't forget to subscribe and follow us on social media. We've been your hosts, Jess Sutherland and Keith Hyams. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we hope you join us for series 2.